Oh, thank you. Well, dear Chairperson, thank you, dear colleagues. So the time is short, I'll just get to the point. So the lecture is titled Best Practices in the program, but I don't claim by any means what I've done is the best practice. Random start is an evolving concept. So I'll just share with you how I think and a few cases from the last 2-3 weeks from our clinic. So let's see. So what is random start? The standard stimulation, historically starts in early follicular phase. This is mainly to ensure like the follicle and the resultant embryo grows in synchrony with the endometrium. So when the embryo blastulates, the endometrium will be in the receptive phase. So that is to ensure a fresh transfer is feasible, okay? So random start is defined by follicular and endometrial asynchrony. So it is only an option if you do not have an intention for a fresh embryo transfer. That's the basic. And then if you are able to forfeit a fresh transfer for any reason, then you can start, that's what random start implies, stimulation when it is convenient for you and for the patient for a multitude of reasons. And the principle of, actually the foremost aim of ovarian stimulation for ART is to ensure you can collect the maximum number of oocytes that that particular patient is capable of producing in one cycle, right? So you need to achieve two things. One, you need to ensure the follicles are stimulated timely, adequately with FSH at least, and then you need to prevent premature LH rises that would end up in premature ovulation. So we need to remember a few principles. So that's how we can navigate in random start cycles. The first is, what enables random start is follicular recruitment from the primordial pool is most likely continuous, if not in waves. So they don't just start growing in the late luteal phase. So whenever you stimulate that, in the follicles to respond. Then, considering LH surge and premature ovulation before the OPU, we need to know LH receptor expression is proportionate with follicle size. In smaller follicles, there's almost no LH receptors. Around like 12, 14, they start appearing and then they increase. So when there's an LH surge or a trigger, the smaller follicles without the LH receptors or without adequate LH receptors will not be affected by it. So that's the second thing we're exploiting here. And the third thing we need to consider is, depending on when I start in the cycle, when is an endogenous, spontaneous LH surge is likely to happen and how it will affect my growing follicles. That's one thing I need to consider. And luckily, endogenous progesterone prevents an LH surge through a hypothalamic mechanism. And the levels of endogenous gonadotropins vary across the cycle, which may help your stimulation or not. So here's what happens. Basically, today, we are close to understanding what really triggers an LH surge, right? So it's not estradiol, clearly. Otherwise, in most stimulated cycles, people would have their LH surges way earlier. So the most likely reason is a small rise in progesterone from a maturing follicle. Okay? So, and in the early follicular phase, FSH and LH are both low. Progesterone is low. There's no suppression on pituitary, but LH surge is unlikely. In the late follicular phase, an LH surge may be imminent. That is the critical thing. In the early luteal phase, gonadotropins are again low, so as progesterone, and in the late luteal phase, progesterone is high. This is what we're using. So follicular phase is standard, so I'm not covering that one anyways. What happens if you start stimulation in the mid or late follicular phase? So your concern would be an endogenous LH surge may occur in an untimely manner and can trigger your mid-sized follicles when they're not ready for collection yet. So how can you manage this? One way is you can do a progestin prime cycle from the start, or you can start antagonists early on, or if you're really in the peri-ovulatory period, you can let the dominant follicle ovulate, and then there won't be another LH surge triggered, and then progesterone will rise. to cover your back. Or you can trigger with an agonist the dominant follicle, so you get rid of that, and then you continue your stimulation as if nothing happened. So let me show you with a few cases. So this is a patient who was 35. Her AMH was 3, until follicle count was 19, so we would freeze eggs. The second column from the left is the cycle day, so she presented on cycle day 9. So again, these are not the only options to do these things, so this is what I picked for a particular patient. See, there was a 15 millimeter follicle, the rest were small, and no sign of an LH rise, everything is as expected. So I chose a PPOS protocol. So started gonadotropin and dihydrogesterone simultaneously. It may be late to prevent that one from ovulation, but doesn't matter, we have the other ones. So I saw her like 6 days later. You see the response is good, many follicles growing, estradiol is high, so she has some endogenous progesterone, and likely it is possible that the 15 might have ovulated in between, but doesn't matter. And I did a dual trigger, and we collected actually 14 oocytes, 12 were mature, and we vitrified them. So it was a convenient stimulation for the patient. Saw once, then saw the second time, triggered, and done. Another option, so this is the patient I showed in the earlier slide. So she's trying to pool oocytes, very low reserve, to be used in a micro TC cycle with the husband. There are a lot of scheduling conflicts. You see here, she presented on day 9. There were already 2 larger follicles, 3 smaller follicles. So this time, sure, yeah. And anyway, so here it is. So 2 larger follicles, 3 smaller follicles. This time I picked an antagonist, started simultaneously. 3 days later, the 2 were almost like mature, so did an agonist trigger, confirmed LH response, collected the 2 mature ones, and then, where did it go? Oh, sorry, I didn't like copy paste, but I showed it earlier today. On the DFX collection, I gave her 1 shot of Elonva, the depot, and in 3 days, she's ready, 3-4 days, she was ready for the second collection. The 3 other follicles grew, which we will collect this Monday, actually. Another patient, mid-follicular, presented on day 8, 34, AMH is less than 1. So our technician really measures every spot on the ovary as a follicle, but anyways, when AFC and AMH is inconsistent, so one suggests low reserve, the other looks more or less normal, the patient usually under response, not very poorly, not as expected by the good one. So I just let this 16 millimeter, where is it? Anyways, on the right ovary, there's a 16 millimeter, the rest are small. So I thought it would just ovulate by itself, FSH wouldn't interfere with it, so I put her on FSH. So like 5 days later, as expected, it ovulated, it disappeared. You see the progesterone started rising, and I continued stimulation, expecting the progesterone would probably, continue rising and prevent another LH surge. I saw her another 4 days later. So here she is, E2 is rising, the follicles are growing like more or less synchronously and nice. Progesterone didn't rise as much as I expected. After I saw the progesterone level, that's why I added the antagonist here. I could have probably continued without adding it. But as I said, these are not the only options. You just use your clinical sense. In another 2 days, she was ready for trigger. We triggered. We got 5 oocytes, not bad for the AMH, actually 5 mature oocytes. And she had 1 euploid from this cycle that's awaiting transfer. Another mid-follicular start, another variation. So I saw her on actually day 9. So there was like a, day 12. So 1 selected follicle at 12 millimeters. The others were like small. So started stimulation. So on the 4th day, realized on the right ovary, the 12 became like 18. So it may ovulate, but the other ones are also growing. By the time endogenous LH surge happened, if it happens in another 2-3 days, the other follicles may be affected as well. So I picked to trigger that one with an agonist at that point. So it ovulated, it disappeared. You see the progesterone is rising. So the other follicles are growing nicely. I just continued as progesterone was reassuring. Until the next visit, I didn't start anything. Probably with 3.18 nanograms per ml progesterone, I might have got away with it, but I still, to be on the safer side, I added an antagonist, dual trigger, and we got like 14 mature eggs. And unfortunately, she's 45. There's not much you can do about the aneuploidy issue here, though. So another case, periovulatory start with spontaneous ovulation. So she's 37. AMH was 1.5 a year ago, not recently. Anyways, she came on day 16, which is periovulatory. The follicle is like 20 on the left ovary, as you can see. I assumed it would ovulate spontaneously again, just started stimulation. As expected, in 4 days, she had ovulated. The other follicles are growing. Progesterone is high, so nothing added. Continue another 3-4 days. Follicles are growing. Progesterone is still high, but it started dropping. I can't predict how fast it will drop. So rather than worrying about it and losing all the follicles, I added an antagonist and triggered in other 3-4 days. And here is what we got: 6 mature oocytes, and we got 2 euploids. And this patient, I treated her 2 years ago again, and you see, like, with standard, like, long protocol, with synchronization, we got like 7 M2s in the other cycle. So with this more flexible approach, our results is the same. And another one where I triggered ovulation myself, I saw the patient on day 10. There's a 16. Her ovarian reserve is very low. That's why the follicles are growing faster, and they can, as explained in the former talk, they can ovulate earlier. So rather than taking the risk, I gave her the agonist trigger. She would ovulate in a day or 2. Then I saw her on the 3rd day, confirmed ovulation. Progesterone is rising. The dominant follicle is gone. So I started stimulation. Saw her like 5 days later. Progesterone was high. I would probably absolutely get away without adding the antagonist. But again, why to take the risk? Because progesterone and antagonists prevent LH surges with different mechanisms. So these are like functioning in an additive manner. So not to take the risk of premature ovulation, I added antagonist and dual trigger. So we got actually 2 mature eggs, 2 blastocysts, both of them were euploid. Okay. So what happens if you start in the early luteal phase? So what I've shown so far is late follicular phase, periovulatory start cycles. In the early luteal phase, so you're not worried about the LH surge because it has already happened. The patient has already ovulated, but progesterone is low, and as you start the cycle now, you may be concerned about whether the progesterone will still remain high enough to prevent LH surge when you need it the most towards the end of stimulation. It may take longer, progesterone may rise and fall. Okay, so you can use a PPOS or antagonist as needed, or you just passively wait until you see progesterone starts to decline, then you add an antagonist if needed. So this is one of my favorite stimulation protocols, basically. So patient came on day 16, 37, moderate ovarian reserve. She had ovulated. Progesterone is 14, right? So I gave her an Elonva. Saw her like 5 days later. Progesterone is still reassuring. The follicles are growing nicely. Estradiol is good. So in another 2 days, actually I could have triggered that day without giving any more injections, but it was a Friday and we don't do collections on Sunday, so I need to push 1 more day. That's why I added the additional gonadotropin. And as progesterone was low now, I added antagonist. Otherwise, I could have just triggered without doing anything else. This is what we got. I mean, like 13 mature oocytes. Unfortunately, none was deployed, but I mean, that has nothing to do with the stimulation. Another patient, 42, low ovarian reserve, less than 0.5, came on day 15, ovulated, progesterone is 6, 1 depot FSH. See 5 days later, progesterone is still high. Follicles are growing, so add nothing. See on the 8th day, when the depot progesterone is finished now, if she needed, I would need to add more injections, which she didn't seem to need. The follicles were big enough, so I just triggered. So she just received 1 injection, and then the trigger, and this is what we got. So this patient is a bit complicated. She's 42, she has dermoid cyst, other benign cyst with some papillary appearance, etc. Oncological assessment. Unfortunately, we didn't get an equal. So mid-luteal, again, the progesterone is high. Mid-luteal is best for synchronization. Endogenous FSH is at its lowest. Follicles are most synchronous, but progesterone will likely decline before you reach trigger, and the stimulation will take longer. So you can use a PPOS or, antagonist. So just, I think, last two cases. Started on day 22. As expected, progesterone is high. You see how synchronous the follicles are. So I picked the PPOS. 5 days later, she is responding. Continue. On the 9th day, almost ready. Give her another 2 days, as there are many follicles anyways, and then trigger. Again, addition of antagonist is an arbitrary choice in a way. They are working with different mechanisms, so I'm trying to decrease the risk of premature ovulation. Advanced age, we got 18 mature oocytes, okay? And 3 euploids, despite the age. So whatever I've told is more or less summarized in this paper. I know Antonio showed this yesterday. So the oocytes collected from cycles that started in the late follicular phase, in the luteal phase, seem to have similar potential as early follicular phase start cycles. The data is pretty consistent on it, so I'm not worried about it. And if we master this endocrinological events, and if we need to schedule the cycle or to exploit any of the advantages of what I've shown, we can modify it to the individual's need. So thank you, and apologies for being late.